I rise in support of this bill. What does this bill do? Well, this Australian Greens bill, amends the Migration Act 1958 so that legislative instruments designated under Section 85, which relates to a limit on visas, can be disallowed. In other words, this bill seeks to ensure that the decisions made by the Minister about visa limits are ultimately accountable to this Parliament. This bill will give the Parliament a final say on visa caps and freezes and not leave it in the hands of a minister who has a track record of capricious and punitive decision-making. So why do we need it? Why are the Australian Greens introducing this important bill? Last week, Immigration Minister Scott Morrison made a decision which plays to cap a limit on the number of protection visas for the 2013-14 financial year. His decision will affect many, many people, the 30,000 asylum seekers who are currently waiting to be resettled in Australia. The freeze is retrospective. That means that as the cap of 1,650 protection visas to be issued for this financial year has already been reached, it leaves those who have already been determined to be refugees in a state of limbo and prolonged uncertainty. Of those 30,000 asylum seekers, 21,000 have been legally determined to be refugees and are living in the community on bridging visas. Let's go back to basics first of all and pause and just remind ourselves, what does it mean to be legally determined to be a refugee? What does it require? And what it means is that it's a person who has been found to have fled their country of origin. It's a person who has fled because they have a well-grounded fear of persecution, and that is because of their race, their religion, their nationality, their membership of a particular social group, or their political opinion. And it also means that it's a person who has been found to have been unable to rely on the protection of the authorities in their country of origin. And so they have fled, seeking refuge, seeking a sanctuary. The Greens don't support bridging visas because they condemn applicants to a state of limbo. These vulnerable people are not allowed to work and may only receive temporary or reduced government financial support which is not adequate to keep body and soul together. I'd like to tell you something about what it's like to live in a state of uncertainty or of limbo, and this is based on a meeting that I had with a young constituent of mine, a young man of 20. I'll call him Jay. His name starts with the letter J. I'll call him Jay. And he approached me recently. He's now 20. He came to Australia in 2010 when he was 17, and he was one of the lucky asylum seekers in a sense, because he actually was granted a permanent visa to remain here indefinitely. Jay was a Hazara refugee from Afghanistan, and while living in Afghanistan with his family, his parents and his 4 siblings, his father disappeared, and it's strongly believed that he was murdered by the Taliban because he was transporting government wheat in his truck. Prior to that and thereafter, Jay and his family were constantly threatened because they wanted to vote, because they were going to school. They were constantly put under threat, until finally, he tells me, his mother beseeched him to leave. She was so fearful that he would also die like his father that she beseeched him to leave, and yet he also told me that when it came to the point of him leaving, she was in tears and strongly wanting him to stay. She was what every mother would be in that situation. She was torn to try and save his life, and yet so sad to see her son heading off wherever, not knowing whether she would ever see him again. So now Jay lives in Adelaide. He works 2 jobs, and his family, his mother and his 4 siblings, were able to escape, and they're living in Quetta in Pakistan, which is a place of extreme risk, and living on a very low income so that they can barely feed themselves and keep body and soul together. I saw Jay because one of his employers of his 2 jobs brought him to me because he was absolutely despairing of Jay's future and also his welfare. he found out that he noticed that Jay was not concentrating very well at work. He'd always been a very hard worker, and it's a labouring manual job, and discovered that Jay hadn't eaten for 48 hours because he was so desperately trying to save money to send to his family, and also to try and save money to be able to bring them to Australia, that he was actually extremely malnourished. So he brought him to me, and he wanted Jay's story to be told. Jay's anxiety and despondency is totally compounded by his fear for his family in Pakistan and the constant knowledge that the money that he is able to send to them from 2 jobs, while also contributing to a household of other asylum seekers who are not employed and not able to work, means that he has no money for himself, but also insufficient money to send to his family. When I met him in September, Jay was actually despairing because he was fully aware of the new government's posturing on immigration, and that it bode very ill for his ability to reunite with his family here, and also, indeed, for the asylum seekers with whom he shared his home, who didn't have permanent visas. And what I want to say is that these punitive policies, as a deterrent, don't work, because no matter how well people like Jay understand the punitive measures our government is providing, they are always going to weigh those up with the conditions in their country of origin. And when someone is facing death or rape or persecution or torture, they ultimately will have no choice but to vote with their feet. All these punitive policies do is actually to compound the suffering that they've already experienced when they come to our country seeking refuge. For Jay, his fear for his mother and siblings' safety is the reason he wants to bring them here. It's that simple. He's an extremely impressive young man. He's an intelligent young man. He would love to study, and particularly maths and science. Whether he'll ever have a chance to do that in Australia, I don't know. But he's a loving son and brother. He feels incredibly responsible and loyal to his family, and he feels intense distress at the dangers that they're in, but also at the uncertainty in relation to the area of asylum seeking and refugees in Australia. So this decision by the Immigration Minister will affect 30,000 asylum seekers. As I said, 21,000 of them are refugees, and the remaining 9,000 asylum seekers are being held in detention centres or community detention. Now, as we know, the United Nations has recently slammed the conditions of Australia's offshore detention camps. Its High Commissioner for Human Rights visited the Nauru and Manus Island detention centres in October last year, and the findings were alarming. They said the centres did not comply with international law standards. What a shameful thing for Australia to have a UN representative saying we do not comply with international law standards. In particular, they found that they don't provide a fair, efficient and expeditious system for assessing refugee claims. Again, uncertainty, again, caprice, rather than having a fair and reliable rule of law that we in Australia would demand for ourselves. They don't provide safe and humane conditions of treatment in detention, and they don't provide adequate and timely solutions for refugees. The implications of this government's freeze on protection visas are devastating. Refugees, including women and children who are being detained or asylum seekers who are being detained in immigration or community detention, some of them for more than 4 years, and those on bridging visas, will never be granted permanent protection in Australia. I have to ask, how deeply is this Australian government, and there is a poor track record on the part of the previous government too, let's be really honest about that, how deeply are these governments in our name willing to sink before they realise that cruelty doesn't work and that it is not the way that we want to behave on the international stage in Australia? By keeping the world's most vulnerable people who've come seeking our help in a state of permanent limbo, the government is compounding refugees' suffering, including increased risk of mental health and physical health problems. And we're already seeing those effects amongst asylum seekers, of course. So we're all aware now, I think, of the 7:30 report about Manus Island in relation to the findings of Amnesty International. Last night, the 7:30 program aired a report with information from AI's researchers and translators who accessed Manus Island last month. These professional people, these people who have seen the best and worst of human rights being upheld or abused around the world, called the conditions in our detention centres cruel, inhumane, degrading and violating prohibitions against torture. That's Australia, that's our responsibility in 2013. One asylum seeker said, "I get about 4 to 5 hours sleep a night due to tension and I have nothing to keep me busy. I'm just thinking and thinking through the night. I'm mostly thinking about how I can't do anything for my family." Amnesty's team has described appalling living conditions on Manus Island, with overcrowding, a lack of medical services and little to no access to communication with the outside world, telephones or the internet. There's a lack of basic things, a lack of soap for the toilets and water, in spite of requests of the medical staff. As the Australian Greens spokesperson for mental health, I'm particularly concerned about the entirely foreseeable impacts on these people's mental health. It's a matter of grave concern to me. We're already seeing a wide range of mental health problems with depression, anxiety, lack of sleep, compounding the impacts of trauma that these people have already experienced, which has led to them fleeing their countries of origin in the first place, particularly where they have been subject to war, conflict and torture. Amnesty reports found that the mental health facilities on Manus Island are not adequate, and that's entirely consistent with the lack of support for people's health generally, with water rations amongst the people living on Manus Island reported to be as little as 500 millilitres per person per day. The UN particularly has slammed the Nauru Detention Centre, saying it is rat-infested, cramped and very hot. And this is a place where people will be living indefinitely. They called for an end to sending children, particularly unaccompanied children, to these detention centres. The UNHCR's Richard Towell has said the toughness of the physical conditions is superimposed on a mandatory detention environment that compounds people's uncertainty. It plays with their, this is my words, it plays with their minds. He said if it's not addressed very carefully, we could see a fairly rapid degradation of psychosocial and physical health if people don't have a fairly early determination of their fate and future. Australia, I'm saying it's reprehensible to treat our most vulnerable fellow human beings in this way. What are we doing? The Senate's decision last week to scrap temporary protection visas was an important step in the right direction. To me, it was a way of drawing a line in the sand and saying we have sunk low, but we will sink no further. I was very proud to vote with the Australian Greens against their reintroduction, because we know that temporary protection visas don't work as a deterrent. They may be punitive, but they do not work if the proposed objective is to deter people. In 1999, when temporary protection visas were introduced, they did nothing to stop the flow of asylum seekers to Australia by boat. In fact, they had the reverse effect. In the 2 years prior to the introduction of TPVs, 1,078 people arrived by boat. In the first 2 years following the introduction of TPVs, 8,312 people arrived by boat. And not only did they not deter the new arrivals, but the devastating impact of denying family reunion was that more women and children were forced to take that perilous boat journey to Australia, which often ends in tragedy, as we know. So, denied the ability to issue temporary protection visas, what was the response of our statesman-like Immigration Minister and Prime Minister? We're currently seeing a very unedifying spectacle of punishment for punishment's sake. It's tit for tat. It's a vindictive move by Scott Morrison and Tony Abbott. They've made a cruel decision to freeze the number of protection visas, deliberately targeting the vulnerable human beings who are most affected by this whole sorry situation. So the freeze will condemn these refugees to live a life of fear and uncertainty. And it leaves open the possibility of returning vulnerable refugees to the very dangers that originally they fled from. The long-term separation from a person's family, from their homeland and from the impacts of arbitrary, indefinite detention in cruel conditions, particularly for the children who are in offshore detention, will only add to the disastrous mental health impacts we're already seeing. This is a far cry from the kind of Australia that I grew up in, that I believed I would be seeing. This is a far cry from the compassion and the decency that I think is at the heart of most Australians, particularly when they know the human faces, the human stories of the people that we're treating in this way. I'd just like to share with you another story about the effects of these policies on human beings, so that we can't turn away and pretend we don't actually know what this does. That each of these 30,000 people that we're talking about, each of them is an individual with a human story and a human context. Recently I visited a small primary school in South Australia. It's one of the primary schools that would benefit from an injection of funds if the Gonski formula is properly applied, because it is an area of disadvantage. But it's a primary school which is a joyous place to visit because it's inclusive, it's respectful, it's incredibly diverse. It's a wonderful place with wonderful staff and wonderful families. And they have a new arrivals program there where they actually welcome children who are living with families on bridging visas, who are living with this uncertainty now. And I was able to visit one of the classes with little children who'd come from all corners of the world with their families, fleeing persecution, looking for a new future in Australia, and these children being given intensive English language classes and an intensive year long before they're able to then move into mainstream schooling. And the joy and the excitement and the endeavour and the enthusiasm of those little kids in that class, this was a class of children between about 5 and 7, was wonderful. And one of their teachers was relaying to me how the uncertainty of what the families live with is so adverse in its effects on those children, that they come, they create, they have a family and a community at that school. The other children, there's a real culture of acceptance and inclusivity and respect and joy in that school. So they make their connections, they make their friends, and then at the flick of a pen or a capricious decision, they can be moved at any time and taken out of that school. And she's seen that happen from time to time. And it means that the children who are little kids like any little kids that have been born in Australia have those basic needs of community, of connection, of friendship, and having come already from a traumatised background are then potentially just ripped out of that school, given that uncertainty, living with that uncertainty in their families, and the effects on their mental health and their well-being and their ability to grow up and reach their potential is severely curtailed by that. She was passionate to me about the issues that they see every day, and yet those teachers are working so hard to try and create an environment of nurturing and care for these vulnerable little kids. I feel so ashamed sometimes when I think that this is the country over which that we are presiding at the moment, and that this is apparently the sort of future that this government and that those who would see a punitive regime in place would be happy to continue. So it's imperative that we as Australian people, members of the community, make sure that the government knows that it must change its way of thinking about asylum seekers and refugees, because we are a caring nation and we should care about those who are wishing to build a new and secure life in Australia, who are putting their trust in this nation. The Immigration Minister's powers under Section 85 are significant. He may determine the maximum number of visas that can be granted in a particular subclass in any specified program. And while all ministers have discretionary powers within their portfolios to make decisions without the need to put everything before Parliament, these particular decisions are so far-reaching and of such consequence to so many powerless people's lives that they require scrutiny. This government has demonstrated an unprecedented capacity for cruelty and retaliation, and for that reason I think it's lost its right to be trusted with this degree of unqualified power. By making the Immigration Minister accountable to the Parliament through this Australian Greens bill, we may ultimately be able to make him accountable to what I consider to be truly Australian virtues of basic decency and simple compassion.